Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today I think we ought to talk about economics. I don't know beans about economics, but I've invited two people who do. And we're going to have a conversation about what I have roughly titled as green economics. But I tell you, usually what happens is I get into arguments with my friends about economics, even though I don't want enough to hold my end up of the conversation. But it's all about whether or not we all have to live simply and cut back on our lifestyle and try to conserve more, or else we're all going to die from all the things that global warming will bring to us, and especially overpopulation, as it were. So that is the issue, and it takes many forms and many different kinds of recommendations. So we're going to talk about that whole question today, and I have two guests with me. In London, England, is Francesco Melito, who is a senior economist with C40 Cities, which is the organization that I think it started off with about 40 of the world's largest cities. The mayors got together and decided that they would try to collaborate in understanding what were the optimum ways of managing their garbage collection and their street lights and their buses and all these other things that have to do with sustainability. And so they have an ongoing, an important organization that includes a very substantial part of the world's population now, because so many people live in cities, and it's grown to close to 100 different cities. I know this much about it because David Miller is on the board of directors of Project Save the World, which is producing this series of shows. And David Miller was the former mayor of Toronto. I think probably the best mayor we ever had. So his senior, they've just published a journal, and I'm going to talk to Francesco about that. And here, a little closer to home for me in Toronto, is Richard Sandbrook, who is a retired professor of political science, University of Toronto, specialist in development work, and especially, of course, that involves third world countries, where he spent a lot of time looking at the economic and social challenges that they face. So, good morning, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Very good. Glad to have you with us. And hello, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. I would just like to emphasize that I'm not an economist. I'm not an ecological economist or any kind of economist.
Yeah.
I regard myself as a political economist, which is quite a bit different.
Oh, yeah. Yes, that's a good thing to point out. And Francesco, you have co-edited or edited a new issue of a particular journal. Would you tell us a little bit to start off about that journal? In fact, why don't we sort of make that the focus of what we want to, the starting point for our conversation, because it's a special journal, and you can tell us the point of view that's represented there. And then I think Richard is going to help me deal with these arguments, because he knows much more about it than I do. So what's the name of the journal, and could people get it online? I'll put a link if you want.
Absolutely, and please do put a link. So the journal is the Journal of City Climate Policy and Economy. It is published in collaboration between C40 and the University of Toronto Press, and it is open access, so everyone can access all the papers. We have a very exciting subscribe to open model. So once we reach a certain number of subscription, our subscribers get the issue first, but then it's open for everyone. And that is something which is very important for us at C40, because we want to make sure that all our member cities, which are half global north and half global south, not all of which will necessarily have the funds to subscribe to academic journals, but we want all of them to be able to access the research that we try to publish in the journal. The special issue is a special issue on ecological economics, which is a particular branch of economics that I'm sure we will discuss with a bit more detail afterwards, but it's focuses on trying to center the economic discourse within and limit it within the planetary boundaries of planet Earth, whereas other aspects of economics may focus on other with other limits when they consider limits at all. But the uniqueness of this special issue is that we try to look at ecological economics from a city perspective. So what are the actions that cities can do to try and promote policies that are compliant with an overall more sustainable economic system, an economic system where no countries exceed their fair share of emission, but also of material use and use of any other planetary boundaries. We were pretty lucky to have Herman Daly help us, the late Herman Daly helped. We started working on the journal before the passing of Herman Daly, and he helped us with our call for paper, and he, I believe, would have helped us with the paper that we received as well if it hadn't prematurely passed in 2022.
Oh, so you've been working on this journal a while.
We have been working on this journal a while. I'm sure Richard as well is familiar with the length and the time frames of academic journals, but it's taken a few months to receive the submissions, to edit them, and so we're pretty pleased with the final result. But it hasn't been quite as snappy and quick as we would have hoped, maybe.
Elaborate a little bit more on the common theme or the point of view that the authors are all addressing. What is the underlying concern that would differentiate their perspective from that of some other maybe more common economic arguments? What I believe you're concerned about resource depletion and pollution and all the things that go with growth. Is that right?
Yes, so that is an aspect of it. I would say, to take a step back, the journal and all the authors start from a recognition that the economic system as a whole needs to be somehow transformed. And this is something that it's not particularly subversive to say. We know that the economic system needs to be transformed. We know that we should be phasing out fossil fuel and to have a more renewable economic system. So this is not particularly transgressive to say. It's interesting is that as the authors that submitted their papers and that are included in the journal try to frame this transformation of the economic system and include other aspects to it, which is, for example, the social equity aspect, or the fact that there may be rethinking what the economic incentives are and what the role of public policy and specifically urban policy may be in making sure that the objective of economic system is not necessarily the increase in size of the economic system, but the increase in prosperity of people, and where they don't go hand in hand, to understand why they don't go hand in hand, and maybe try to intervene instead of having a very free market and laissez-faire approach.
Okay, Richard, is there enough there for you to see how your own perspective connects with what he's said?
Yes, well, let me say, first of all, I think C40 is a really great idea, that the largest cities in the world should try and form some unified understanding of how to respond to the climate crisis. I think that's absolutely great. Beyond that, I think that the way C40 approaches the issue is commendable. For example, the emphasis on inclusiveness is extremely important in trying to deal with it, that all groups have to pay a price for making a transition. The idea that that inequality is systems of inequality are closely related to the climate crisis, and therefore, when we're talking about surmounting climate change, we're also talking about reducing the level of equality. And I also really appreciate the idea that's in the C40 documents about the importance of political coalitions. That this is a political problem to a large extent, and therefore, you can't ignore the political aspect of it. I think all that is really fantastic. On the other hand, there is bound to be a kind of problem in approaching it. Certain things can be done at the city level. Some very important things can be done in terms of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to the overall kind of societal, or this idea of economic transformation, for example, which you did talk about as being necessary, then we get into the problem, or the reality, I guess is a better way of putting it, that that climate change is a global problem, as we all know, quite obviously, and that also is a national problem, a problem that needs to be addressed at the level of the nation state to begin with, but as well, of course, at the global level. That's harder to work. Working through the national state, which is incomparable in its ability to actually implement the policies which are contained in the whole post-growth approach. We use the word post-growth to cover a wide range of perspectives. Then that would require work beyond the cities. And the cities, so when we're talking about politics of change, the fact is that the cities are where the powerful groups are located. I mean, where the headquarters of fossil fuel corporations are, and the financial institutions that underwrite fossil fuel production and distribution are located. And they're very powerful politically, obviously. And so therefore, it's on the one hand, it's very important to have these cities involved. On the other hand, it's a very tricky situation for them to be in, the mayors of these cities and so on, because the powerful groups in their own cities are in fact often allied in one way or another with fossil fuel interests and the existing economy. So there is an issue there that is very complex. I mean, I'm not being critical, because I'm just pointing out an obvious difficulty for C40 in operating within this context of a problem which is global in scope, which involves a certain kind of economy, which I would refer to as neoliberal capitalism, to be a bit more precise, and that it requires a political solution which goes beyond the city level. So overall, I'm very, very positive. I also am very appreciative of the difficult situation that cities are in dealing with this issue.
If I may add another aspect, and Richard, thank you for pointing out, cities indeed are, they have a lot of power, but they don't quite have as much power as national states. But the one thing that they do have is that, as you pointed out, the majority of the world's population lives in cities. And that's going to be increasingly so. That's one of the major structural trends that we're seeing. So the influence that city government will have on humanity's day-to-day life is increasing day by day, because it is more and more of us live in cities. But I think one thing that we also should remember is, because more and more cities live in cities, as climate change and the climate crisis effects intensify, they will also mean that when they hit, when natural disasters may hit cities, then this city, like more and more people will be affected by it. Density comes with many advantages in terms of agglomeration economies and all the beauty that comes with being close to people. But at the same time, it comes with the cost that when there is damage happening to cities, that could be quite costly in terms of human life and in terms of the economic costs. So cities at C40, we like to say that they are they're at the front of the climate emergency, both on the positive, in a positive way, in terms of leading policy and leading with innovation and ideas. But at the same time, we're also at the forefront in terms of, a lot of cities in the world are coastal cities. A lot of cities in the world are incredibly vulnerable to natural disasters, and clearly all the geopolitical unrest that can hit them. So much, they are clearly a human construction, and in being so, they are very fragile to anything that puts in danger the human condition, and climate change is a massive part of this.
It seems to me everything that both of you have said so far is self-evident. I can't see that you're saying anything that anybody in the world would disagree with, but there are disagreements. So what is the nature of the controversy that you're engaging with, or that the articles are trying to help us cope with or understand? What's controversial about this whole thing?
So I would say that the main thing that is controversial is that the large majority of our hopes to combat climate change rely on the rapid implementation of technological innovation, some of which we already know that we possess, like renewable energy, others that we are hoping that we will possess in the future, like an affordable carbon capture and storage situation, for example, for CO2. The problem is that this technological innovation and its impact of the technological innovation on human well-being is non-neutral. It depends on the social choices that we make on how these innovations are used. And I will make an example about a different technology to make it clear. If we develop a camera or a film camera, we can use it to film friends and have very lovely memories, but we can also use it to spy as a government, a malicious government, to spy people. The technology is exactly the same. The social choice that we make with that technology and the power that is attached to any specific technology, the ownership of the technology, changes how that is used. This is the same with renewable energy. It's the same with the shift in energy system. And so if we're saying that we're changing, we're completely overhauling our energy system and ideally other systems as well, and we want to keep this equality lens and inclusivity lens, then we cannot avoid focusing also on other aspects of it. So stop thinking about purely economic growth and making sure that the pie gets as big as possible, but also consider the distribution and other aspects of it, which are not necessarily economic, but are social as well. So is everyone enjoying and benefiting from this transition? Who is the ultimate owner of the energy system now? Is this different than what it used to be before? And this is
because I think what I want to do is sharpen up what you just said. You said not only growth, but also equity, et cetera. Nobody's going to argue with that. But I have, you mentioned Herman Daly. And the only thing I know about Herman Daly is that he is a guy who was arguing in favor of no growth. We have to stop economic growth, like stop it, not just slow it down or make it other things, but stop growth. And that is, I think, as I understand it, quite a controversial thing. About a year or 2 years ago, I interviewed a guy named Robert Pollin, who had co-authored a book with Noam Chomsky, which I haven't read, but I did talk to him about this. And their position is that if you stop growth, you really are going to have a recession like nothing in the world, because people will really suffer. People who are poor will be the ones who suffer the most, et cetera. That we really need to have continued growth in order to have prosperity at all. Now, sorry to be rude about trying to exacerbate a conflict and make it even more extreme than maybe really, but I think that's where your enemies are lurking in the bushes, ready to contradict everything you've said. Am I right?
You're bang on the nail, correct. And I think this is due to the most common name of a lot of these post-growth theories, some of which, a branch of which is referred to as degrowth, which is commonly interpreted as we should just tank the economy and not have an economy anymore. Whereas for the majority of this post-growth theory, a lot of scholars will now refer to it as growth agnostic. And the way that this translates to, and I believe Robert Pollin would feel the same, that not every sector of the economy needs to grow. And at the moment, and that's definitely what Herman Daly felt as well, some sectors are actively harmful in terms of what they do, but other sectors can easily grow. And the balance of what it was calling the steady state economy is that overall the economy doesn't grow, but there are sectors within the economy that we should try and curtail, whose activities we should try and curtail. And the example here is very clearly the fact that we should definitely have very rapid growth in the energy sector in terms of renewable energy, but this should come hand in hand with a reduction in other aspects of the same energy sector that are currently harmful. Now, the question is, can that happen while overall reducing the size of the economy? This is where a lot of urban policies come in. So if instead of looking at it from a GDP and gross domestic product perspective, you look at what people actually want, it's very easy to realize that a lot of what people want is not necessarily linked to the size of an economy, but is linked to the shape in which the services that people want take place. So, for example, the majority of people don't necessarily want to drive around and burn lots of gas driving around. They want to reliably get from point A to point B. So if a city is designed for people to be able to walk, cycle, take public transport, and for the people that really need to drive, only the minority of them to drive, then ideally, the economy of that city may as well, or at least the transport sector economy of the city will be smaller than a city in which everyone owns an ever bigger car, simply because by producing all those cars, you get a larger economy. By having a well-being framework, one considers, but if we're not maximizing from size and number of cars, but we're maximizing for how happy people are in getting reliably from point A to point B, we see that a smaller economy alternative of that city, where you don't necessarily are not as GDP rich, but have the same services available to you. So you get the same accessibility of transport, but without the size of the economy is possible. And so that is what a lot of growth agnostic and the thinking of degrowth verges towards. You get the same access, and ideally better access than currently people have, but in a more equal way, in a way that is cheaper for people to access, that is more inclusive, because not everyone can afford to rent a car or store a car or buy a car, and it's also less destructive. So that would be the main aspect. So some aspect of the economy 100% have to grow. Some countries have to grow. There is a lot of many countries in the global south that desperately need economic growth. But on balance, there are also entire sectors that should probably, cause more economic damage than they create economic value.
When you ask what is the controversy, well, at the one big controversy which Francesco has just entered into, but not to my mind, not entirely clearly, because he started off more with a green growth perspective and then slipped more into a possibility of there being degrowth within cities and certain overall sectors. The issue is the viability of the dominant approach, which is green growth, viability in the longer term. Can you really hope to have eternal growth and prosperity together with safeguarding the ecological foundations for future generations? That's a real issue. The debate is not over. There's always a possibility of some really quite startling technological discoveries that may come along, but can we trust in that? Can we trust there will be the technological that carbon capture and storage, for example, will become viable, whereas right now it's still very, very inadequate to the overall task. And so many other technologies too are still either very expensive, potentially dangerous, or inadequate. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. But I think so. The broader question is whether we can live within ecological boundaries, so to speak, and still have economic growth. And this is an argument that goes back to 1972. With the Limits to Growth report to the Club of Rome. It was a remarkable report so early on, which sparked an enormous amount of controversy for many years among economists on one side saying, that there are no such things as really absolute scarcities and limits, that we can innovate and shift, substitute various inputs or resources for others. So that debate's gone on for a long time and continues today, and is really the major one, the major kind of dividing point. On the one hand is the green growth, sort of green capitalism perspective, that you can in fact hope for this at least some level of economic growth. I mean, obviously there has to be in many developing countries, no matter what system. In very poor countries, there's no way one can ever advocate an end of growth. But we're talking about the the industrialized countries, maybe even the emerging economies. In those situations, can we actually survive on this planet with perpetual growth? If we think we can, we're actually putting an enormous gamble on technology, because for example, it's not really possible to simply transfer from one energy system to another, from fossil fuels to green energy, without having enormous ecological catastrophes result from for one thing, from the enormous level of increase in mining, which are very, of all the essential elements of a green economy, which itself will set off protests and therefore a whole set of social movements, which are already coming into being in the developing world. So that if you're asking for the controversy, the fundamental one is this division between green growth and those who believe that really we need to move away from this. And when you say move away from it, then there are different viewpoints of how that can be done. And degrowth is one perspective, which actually believes you need to get beyond capitalism in order to have ecological sustainability. That's a very radical view. Not all degrowth people believe that, by the way, but substantial number do believe that they begin with a critique of capitalism as such, that it leads to growth and that growth leads to ecological destruction. And therefore you need to surmount capitalism. That strikes me as an improbable situation in the next decade or two. I think you always have to bear in mind we have limited time to make these decisions. It isn't though we can just say, oh well, we've got unlimited future. We've got a decade or two to make some really fundamental changes. And it seems to me that the degrowth people who believe in this, and the eco-socialists too, who go along with this view that you need to really transcend capitalism, are really in an improbable situation. But there are versions of the Green New Deal out which are much more user-friendly and more reformist within capitalism, that have a way of dealing with this problem. And as for that book on the Green New Deal by Pollan and Chomsky, although Pollan believes that economic growth needs to continue, in fact, Chomsky does not have that same view. I mean, the book you refer to that they have their names appended to is a collection of interviews with them on various topics. So they don't necessarily agree on everything. But obviously, whatever we say, green growth, if you want to develop the green economy with new sources of green energy, you're going to have economic growth to begin with, a spurt of growth, because of the massive public investment in the whole infrastructure of a green economy. So no one could logically argue that you're not going to have a spurt of growth if we can undertake this transition to a green economy. What matters is what happens after that. And I think that then I don't believe it's possible to have perpetual growth, increase in the gross domestic product, and still have a world, an Earth, for future generations. So I think we are necessarily driven to the more moderate Green New Deal approaches, which do try and to develop a green economy, but also develop coalitions to try and bring about this constraints on throughputs of energy and resources.
Let me say where I get hung up, and that is I used to go to communist countries while they were still communist. I used to go to Russia and Eastern Europe, etc. And I, frankly, am not very, very much in favor of communism. I'll tell you that. It didn't look to me like any place I wanted to live. So what else have you got? You got communism, you got socialism, you got capitalism. And however much one says one doesn't like capitalism, I like it a whole lot better than what I saw in Eastern Europe and Russia. All right. So I want to keep capitalism in some form because I just plain don't like any alternative I know of unless you can tell me one. So here's what the problem. Capitalism is based on the notion of capital making money, right? I have money, I invest it in the bank lends it to some company that wants to grow. At the end of the year, they borrowed the money, they've put in the new equipment or whatever. They have to have made more money at the end of the year than they did at the beginning, so they can pay the bank back and the bank can pay me. Well, that's capitalism and that's growth. And if you don't have that, I don't know how you're going to have anything that looks like an economy, a free market kind of economy. So if you got an alternative, let me have it.
So I think this is a very good point, Meta, but I'm afraid that there is one flaw in your argument, which is when a bank lends you money, you can give the money back without having growth, because what they're lending you against is your future earnings, not the increase in your future earnings. And this is very much linked to if you think about mortgages. When you think about mortgages, there is no expectation that you will have to repay back based on the increasing value of your house. You just have to are borrowing money against your future capacity to pay that money back. And so is it perfectly possible for a company to borrow money and then saying, we're going to give you this money back in 10 years time. And with the income that they make during the 10 years, the income can be very stable. It doesn't have to grow. So I'm just talking from a purely theoretical perspective, you can pay the money back. So there isn't anything inherent in the economic system that means that the economic system has to grow. However, the entirety of capitalism is based on the expectation that growth needs to be there. And so whenever we do not have growth, which periods in which we call recessions, then we're in big trouble. Unemployment goes up. There's problems with companies firing people, and that's because the expectation is that growth is always there. I think the idea of a transformed economic system, I don't think is necessarily a transformed economic system that wants to go to communism or wants to go to the predecessor of capitalism in the West, which would be mercantilism, which was a terrible version, a terrible economic system. I believe it's a system in which capitalism has a less predatory shape, takes a shape that is more conscious of the limits of the planet. So you still have freedom of activities, but a freedom not just to do whatever you want, but also a freedom within the limit of you cannot consume your way to death. And that is a very important aspect. And it doesn't have to be done with impositions but it can be done somehow in a positive way. And that's why I would like to go back to the city element of it. So these ideas are very hard to discuss and to think about at the national level, the international level, because changing the entirety of the international economic system feels very hard. And I definitely agree with Richard, is not something we can do with the speed that is required to take action on climate change. However, at the urban level, a lot of these ideas are almost truisms. The degrowth option is very often the preferred option for people to be happier at a very local level, which is, we're much happier if the road where we live has fewer cars rather than more. You still have access to the cars and to transport, but you have less of those. We're much happier if instead of having, for example, multinational corporation trying to get like the best possible rent, you have the local shop in your area. And that's because there is something which is intangible in this. It is less economical. It's definitely less profitable to have a mom and pop shop down the road than there is to have a corporation. But somehow it is when we look at people's perception, that is what people prefer. Not necessarily with their wallets, but that's also because individuals don't always have an economic choice to make. Very often businesses are driven bankrupt before that people can support them. But I think my main point would be that at the city level, a lot of these more sustainable choices can be made without them being revolutionary. And it is something we make a lot of people live in a way that if we were to impose on people would be revolutionary, but it's just the normal common way. Not owning a car and cycling for most people would be like, why would we be going back 150 years now that we can afford very good and efficient vehicles that can travel many miles? But in very dense urban Amsterdam, it's complete madness. And an Amsterdam resident is very happy to only have access to a car if and when they need it for specific purposes, but not being forced to get into a private vehicle. And a system where the beauty of technology is accessible to us when we need it, and not as a pre-requirement to be part of the economic system, because otherwise there is no access to jobs and there is no access to healthcare, because you do not have this base level of very high consumption. It's not a system that is particularly sustainable nor inclusive.
I mean, I agree with Francesco. And for example, if you could make the public transportation system so excellent that people would prefer to actually use it than cars, that would be a wonderful change. And I lived in Copenhagen for a while, and this was some time ago now, 20 years ago. But I found that in Copenhagen, many people didn't have cars unless they live way out in the suburbs. And you could go anywhere. If you're going to the opera, people would take the bus. Here, in Toronto or other places, very few people take the bus or the subway to the opera. But there it's just regarded as what you do. In your elegant clothes, you get off the bus and go into the. So in other words, people, if you make amenities accessible to people, they find that life is better. As this is precisely what can be done at the city level. I think that's a really positive approach. But on the larger issue that you posed, Madam, I have a comment on that, which is basically capitalism and growth, and is capitalism inherently growth oriented? And Francesco had a very important point about actually repaying money, which is one part of the issue. What I would say is that most people on the left and the right believe that capitalism is inherently growth oriented. It has to have growth to survive. It's certainly on the left, not only the Marxist left, but most of the people in the degrowth category as well. And the left in general, I found, believes that capitalism and growth are conjoined. If this is so, we are really in pretty dire problem, a pretty dire state, if we really do need to level off our growth to negligible growth in the industrial countries in order to live within ecological boundaries. And I think actually I agree with Herman Daly on this, the point that in fact it's not true that the logic of capitalism is growth. I think it is not grow or die, but rather profit or die. And profit is not the same thing as growth. This is I'm sort of rephrasing what he said in a way, but getting close to what his life work was about, in stating that that you can have profit, even in a situation where throughputs of energy and resources are constrained, because there's still necessity of firms to compete to make profit through being more productive, more efficient in their use of resources. So productivity increases, which workers can also share in if they have trade union rights. And as well, entrepreneurs can create new quality goods, higher quality goods, which also will undercut their opposition. So competition, entrepreneurship, innovation are still very much in demand within a capitalist system in which there are constraints on throughputs. The whole difficulty is not economic. It is not an economic problem. I think that this kind of understanding of how the economy works is actually accurate. The problem is political, because what you would need to do is to change the rules of the game of the economy. Every economy operates according to certain institutions, which is basically another saying a set of rules of the game. We could reset an economy if we had the political power, which did constrain inputs, and firms would have to adjust to that. Capitalism is enormously versatile. in the sense that firms have adjusted to all kinds of constraints. No one would have believed in the early 20th century that there would be the social democratic welfare state, for example, with all of the constraints that the social democratic welfare state placed on all the factors of production, labor, land, and money, were all restricted under the Keynesian social democratic welfare state. And it operated very well for 40 years. So, there is the issue of how you change the rules of the game, where the most powerful actors are those who have a stake in the existing order. And what makes that even more difficult today to work, and we haven't even mentioned this issue yet, is right-wing populism and conservatism, which now have become denialists when it comes to climate change. Even the conservative parties are now taking aim at climate policies to curry favor with one half of the population that may be amenable to those appeals. So the political equation, which we haven't brought in yet, which is the resurgence of right-wing populism, not only in the United States, but really throughout Europe and throughout the world in general, makes it even more difficult to reset the rules of the game in the way we might want to do so to create a more ecologically sustainable economy and lifestyle.
I'm hung up by the first thing, almost the first sentence you made, where you differentiated between profit and growth. I'm still trying to imagine how a company could make a profit if they hadn't grown. The income, how much money they own at the end of the year has to be more than they had at the beginning in order to make any profit. And that is growth. So I don't understand. Now, I hear it's often couched in the framework of decoupling economic or resources, pollution, resource depletion, etc., from growth. So I can imagine, this probably an economist would laugh at me, but I can imagine that if at the end of the year you pay people more through, so they have a bigger income because you're just paying them more, you give them more money, or you pay them for things that you didn't used to pay them for, like writing poems or something. You pay them for things that do not involve the use of material resources, or the depletion of resources, or the use of the pollution from resources. Then you could have some kind of economic growth without, ruining your environment or using up all of everything that you own. But I think that's probably a silly idea, but it's the only idea I can come up with that could still allow me to believe that there can be growth without, having the people live in terrible, catastrophic environmental conditions as a result. Tell me how you're going to do it. I just don't know how.
You make a very good point. So if we were to increase the share of the economy that comes from the service sector, and ideally the part of the service sector that is less material intensive, you would decrease the energy intensity and the carbon intensity of the economy. If you were to dematerialize your economy, so mostly focusing on offering services that use less resources, you could potentially continue to have growth in terms of the actual size of the economy, of what we value as a service. That is perfectly fine. There is a flip side to this, which is that the majority of our economy is still a consumption economy. So what would people do with their income, and how their daily needs and what is considered a need is produced is still part of the equation. Now, in some economies, the largest aspect of the economy is services. However, services are not always very kind on the world. So yes, writing poems, fantastic example of a service that you could give to someone that is quite kind on the world. Taking a flight is a service sector, not as kind on greenhouse gas emissions. So not all services are the same, and the use of resources in each subsector will affect this. So yes, ideally you could continue to have growth if you only have growth in low energy intensity sectors.
Okay,
There's
now
nothing.
you were arguing back there that people would be happier if we lived in mom and pop stores and not in high tech society. I didn't agree with that, I don't think, but I would agree that probably people are happier if they spend most of their money, more and more of their money, on what we would call services. It could be getting a massage. It could be signing up for a course in Udemy, which I'm about to give a course on. Or it could be going psychotherapy, or it could be taking yoga lessons. I think people do switch more to non-material. You don't have to use much energy to do massages. This kind of service, I think, is more consistent with the lifestyle that I would think people would enjoy more than traveling to around the world on cruise liners, for example.
I would agree. So there is definitely a big tendency of focusing more on the experience. However, I should correct. If I come across as saying people would be happier if they were going to mom and shop, that's not what I meant. What I meant is there is a preference which is revealed in, for example, when people travel. Very few people travel all across the world and then go and visit the mall. What they do is what you find very charming and what you think is prettier is the smaller kind of experience. Then it's not necessarily what happens in your day-to-day spending habits, but there is definitely like a beauty of it. And if you were to ask the majority of people what they would prefer to have on the road, if a mall or a smaller shop, local shop where they knew the owner, the majority of people, and this is surveys that are run, and you can see very clearly, at least in countries where there is discretionary planning and where, for example, like the UK, where people can oppose every single planning application that happens down the road, what they oppose and what they don't oppose. So anything that is perceived as a big, large chain tends to have a less warm reaction than the nice, lovely local pub. But I'm not necessarily saying that people would be happier in one or the other. Not that one is more productive or that would help us solve the climate. It's just what would make a city more lively and more welcoming. I would agree with you that the experiences aspect is very important. However, as I was saying, not all experiences are the same. As you pointed out, cruises are an experience effectively sold as a service, but are very polluting, have a very high footprint in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Getting a massage, significantly less so unless you're flying to get it straight from on the other side of the world.
So, I mean, people can change their preferences. So within a consumer society, we with all the advertising going on, we have certain ways we think we want to live. But if new opportunities are put to us, such as limits on traffic in big cities and more availability of public transit, then they can actually change how they enjoy life. They may take up cycling, for example, if that becomes less dangerous. So change is always possible. With we don't have set preferences that way. But to get back to the really key theoretical issue of growth and capitalism, I would like to make one point, and that is that what Daley was referring to, and what I am also referring to, is the throughputs of energy and resources in the economy. This is what Herman Daley wanted to limit to a certain level. And that doesn't mean there can't be what we call economic growth because of productivity, because you can have the same amount of resources. Now, normally, economic growth has meant more use of energy and more use of raw materials, although not as much as before because we become more efficient in their use. But nonetheless, always this kind of relationship between economic GDP growth and throughputs and energy. Mm-hmm. So the idea was then to limit throughputs. I think where Herman Daley went wrong on this is that you're never going to have a scheme of limiting every resource going through a national economy. It's just too complex to do. The state would not have the ability to auction off all these resources. It's a kind of an ideal. It's not something that could ever be achieved, in my estimation. But what can be achieved, and is I think important, is constraining throughputs through, for example, I mean the latest report to the Club of Rome, 2022, Earth for All, is a very good report, and it has one policy it elaborates in some depth, which is the Citizens Fund and Universal Dividend, which is an idea of regarding natural resources or nature either as a source of inputs or as a sink for pollutants, as being part of as being commonly owned, as part of the commons, and that any firm wishing to use the commons has to pay for a levy on that use. A levy also on the use of public data, which in the internet is now used privately, but is actually part of the common of the commons, according to this. So it is possible to conceive.
Hold on, elaborate on that. What do you mean? You're going to charge people for access to government records of or things like that? When you say
the big data companies that use our data and sell it to other corporations, such as advertising agencies, to manipulate basically the public to buy certain products, and for other political reasons as well, that kind of data would be regarded as part of the commons, and companies would have to pay to use that data. That's the basic idea of this. But as well, in terms of natural resources, there would be a levy placed on the use of lumber and other inputs into the economy, and also in pollution. It's really an attempt to make it way more expensive to use inputs, and therefore to economize on their use. It wouldn't necessarily lead to no growth, but it would lead to a constraint on throughputs, which is really what we need to do. It's just one idea they have, but I think it's actually quite a good one and perhaps workable, at least in theory.
First I ever heard of that. I don't know. What do you think of that, Francesco?
Well, that is very much what like a lot of taxation tends to happen, and like we think of taxes as a relatively old-fashioned term, but a tax is literally adding to the price of any good, and by doing so, effectively making you, discouraging you from buying that good because it makes it ever so slightly more expensive. And then with the taxation money, this gets redistributed either as benefits or as dividends, but most often as services. So that is, a very good system. Very good. A system that we have established and that works very well. There are theories, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, about having, for example, taxation specifically on carbon. There is which is particularly hard to do at a global level. It's particularly hard to do because we would have to consider we would find ourselves in a bit of a quandary because we either consider all carbon emitted the same. And so the 1 ton of carbon that you emit building a hospital is taxed the same as that of by running a coal power plant. And I think we agree that morally they're not the same. But then if we decide those two are not the same, we would have to decide on each and every sector. So is the same, is it then okay to the 1 ton of carbon emitted? What should be the rate for when you fly? What should be the rate for when you order fresh food? But what if you cannot afford fresh food? So it's very hard. It's very easy. And many economists really like the idea of a global carbon tax and a carbon tax as an elegant solution to something. And it is an elegant solution until we start realizing that we would treat the same activities that we wouldn't morally recognize as having the same weight, and we want to discourage some of them and not others. And the beauty of the concept of net zero is that within the net zero there is some emission still going on, and so there is going to be something that we think as humanity is worthwhile emitting CO2 for. Mm-hmm. But in the current system, we don't currently have built in that morality. And so Richard earlier was mentioning advertising. there are currently very few limits on sectors that can advertise. We have, for example, advertisement bans in many countries on smoke and tobacco, but we don't have any advertisement ban for people to buy their 10th pair of shoes. And until, unless they are like an insect, you don't necessarily need many more beyond your third, fourth, or fifth pair of shoes. But there is no limit on that. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that there should be a limit on that, but morally, there will be many ways in which, at least to encourage people to consume in a more responsible way, which is very hard. So without putting the onus on the person, then try to look at what is the sector that is driving this, and advertising is one of the main culprits. So there are, yeah.
I want, our time's up, but I want to ask each of you to propose the one innovation or structural change in the economy that you think is the most promising in terms of really changing the quality of our problem. This is helping to solve the problem of making it possible for a large population to live on this earth and not use everything up. What would you most each like to enact as a reform if you could do it in the next 5 years? Francesco, you go first, and then Richard, it'll give you time to think up something.
My one policy would be a universal job guarantee, and that's because we have to completely overhaul our economic system. If anything, if at the very least the energy system, but sadly humans are not very fungible. So all the people that currently work in fossil fuel and in systems that we know that are not sustainable and compatible with net zero will have to effectively find new jobs. We know that is going to be very hard, and historically we have really struggled with transitioning sectors, and we see the scars of left behind areas all over the world. And so having a universal job guarantee, government, and ideally even international sort of system to make sure and ensure people that if for whatever reason we decide that the industry you're in should be curtailed, you will not be left to fend for yourself. And there is going to be a way to retrain people and to try to encourage them into different industries and not leave them behind. So that would be mine.
I'll vote for that. Okay, Richard, you.
Well, I have trouble answering your question because I don't think in terms of a single policy, but rather in terms of policies forming programs that can be implemented over a certain period of time. And secondly, I don't like discussing, what my favorite policy would be outside of the political forces that operate and whether at all that is feasible, what I'm suggesting. So that puts constraints on how I can respond to your question. But for me personally, as I have understood it through my own reading and trying to be open-minded to various viewpoints, there's the best way for us to proceed is with a kind of Green New Deal that is working within capitalism and doesn't challenge private property, and therefore can gain support from within the business class, from all those interests that are tied up with the green economy. Is much more feasible than let's say, the degrowth people who want to overthrow capitalism. And it can be done in an incremental way. What I like about the Green New Deal, to be very, very concise, is that it was developed mainly by activists and politicians rather than academics such as myself. And therefore whereas degrowth is intellectually very dense and very powerful, it's written by extremely powerful people, intellectuals, and it all makes sense. It has a logic of itself, but it's improbable. It won't happen. Where on the Green New Deal, on the other hand, is put together by coalitions and it's much more user-friendly. And so I think the movement towards an idea that, first of all, social equity goes along with environmental sustainability is a central part of the Green New Deal, but also of degrowth as well. That's a very important point. And that one thing that needs to be added to the Green New Deal is, I think, the idea of constraining throughputs, but that's in the longer term, because right now that would lead to a great deal of opposition we couldn't overcome. So that's my long-winded response.
Very, very interesting. Okay. Would you agree with him, Francesco?
I would agree that the politics of these economic ideas are much more difficult to navigate than the economics ideas themselves. And I'm trying to bring it back to working at the city level. One of the beauty of this is that all the mayors that work with C40 probably disagree on many other issues, economic and social issues. And so the beauty of having them collaborate on a single one is a small miracle. And so I would agree with Richard that the politics of it and the beauty of the Green New Deal is the fact that it's feasible in terms of like the political aspect of it, at least with a large part, and more so than other economic currents. But so yes, so it would get my political support.
Okay. Well, this has been fun, and I've learned a little bit. So let's try it again sometime. Thank you. Good wishes to all your mayors, by the way. It's a wonderful project. Take care. See you. Bye.
Good to meet you, Francesco. Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces these forums. This is episode number 589. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues, and we welcome your comments too. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org. and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. Please type "subscribe my group" as the subject of your email. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.